Before we go any further, let's look into the ethereum. If one recalls, the ethereum were the remainder ruling class of the Karash, and had sworn vengeance upon Dementius the All-Devouring. In pursuit of this, the most elite of the ethereum sought to merge with the Void itself, becoming Void Ethereals and re-establishing their power in the cosmos. This was too much for Amir, who took his protectorate and, with the assistance of the consortium, and copious aid from Horde Alliance adventurers, depowered the Nexus King Salhadar and slew him. Though, the ethereum did not die with him. Meanwhile, the Eldors and the Scryers had moved up from barely tolerating to active coordination. While still nipping at each other verbally, both forces combined knowledge and resources into tracking down the second highest-ranking Legion agent in Outland, Sokrathar, a former Draenei turned traitor. Felling such a powerful demon lord would require adventurers, Eldor, and Scryers united, a lesson they would not soon forget. At this point, you're probably wondering what happened to Farallon. Mere months prior to the extended Horde Alliance force arriving, the region really was a lush plain of life and jungle. The Sons of Lothar had established a base here under the auspices of the Kirin-Tor wizards, calling it Kirinvar, as part of the expedition into Draenor during the Second War. Home to the Archmage Vargoth, Kirinvar were attacked by the rogue Blood Elven Prince, and the survivors bore first-hand witness to the assault on Tempest Keep. Kael'thas' forces reverse-engineered the Naro technology and figured out a way to use Nether rechargers to draw the energy of the Nether into Tempest Keep. Obsessed with a way to feed his people's magical hunger, Kael'thas pushed for this plan, despite objections. This much raw, arcane, and fell power being drawn in directly from the Nether devastated the land, and was in fact the cause for Outland's slide into self-destruction that the Cenarian expedition had been fighting against this entire time. But careful, tempered terraforming could not keep up with this level of raw brute force alterations. The Monoforges would have to be silenced. In the process of invading, infiltrating, and decommissioning the Monoforges, the Horde Alliance force became aware of just how far Kael'thas had fallen. We've discussed Kael'thas several times in brief. Let's try a little bit more detail. Son of Anasterian Sunstrider, the king of Quel'Danas, Kael'thas was also a member of the Council of Six, the ruling council of the Kirin-Tor of the magocratic state of Dalaran. Kael'thas was charismatic and charming individually, but when it came to matters of state, always swayed towards cold indifference. Kael'thas was in Dalaran when the Scourge ran roughshod over Quel'Danas, and upon hearing the news, returned home as swiftly as he was able. After events previously covered in Quel'Danas, Kael'thas took his best soldiers and offered his services to the Alliance, and encountered the highest-ranking surviving member of Lordaeron's forces, Othmar Garithos. Garithos was a horrible human being, a terrible leader, and a colossal bigot. His misuse and abuse of the Blood Elves and Kael'thas personally led to their imprisonment on trumped-up charges of treason, and, facing execution, Kael'thas and his forces threw in their lot with the Naga, under Lady Vashj. Kael'thas and Vashj journeyed to Outland in search of Illidan and, along with Akama, worked with Illidan to defeat Magtheridon and claim dominion over Outland. But none of this left Kael'thas with a solution for his people's hunger for magic. And while the specifics of why are uncertain, one way or another, Kael'thas' mind slowly unraveled. In short order, Kil'jaeden, who at this point was still setting up his plan to destroy Illidan along with the Azerothians, tempted Kael'thas with the knowledge of Fel. Kael'thas resisted at first, but he'd been through a lot in a short time. He was ripe for corruption. Vorenthal and the Scryer's defection proved the final straw, and Kael'thas formally sided with Kil'jaeden. And, thus, everything Kael'thas' forces, the Sun Fury, have been up to since their assault on the Tempest Keep. The truth of Kael'thas' defection uncovered, the Scryers spread knowledge of this far and wide, killing what last popular support the Fallen Prince still had, especially among the Blood Knights. Scryer, Eldor, and Horde Alliance forces quickly began a joint operation to bring Kael'thas down before he could do even more long-term damage. all agreed an assault on the satellites first was most prudent, and they split their forces up to assault each in turn. The Alcatraz was a Naru prison facility, still maintained by Kael'thas' forces, for a certain definition of maintained. The prison facilities were so out of control that a rogue void wraith, Zaraketh the Unbound, had roamed in and was enjoying the latent void energies, and quite possibly the show. Further in were the husband and wife duo, Wrath-Scryer Socrates and Delia the Doomsayer. Both were recently released prisoners, and the married couple being forced into confinement with one another severely hampered each other's moods. At the very end was found an imprisoned Kiraji, Harbinger Skyrus, whose persuasive voice was able to twist the mind of Warden Melikar into the havoc wrought upon the satellite. Fortunately, the Kiraji was a better manipulator than he was a fighter, and with his passing, the Alcatraz was able to calm down somewhat. As an aside, one of the prisoners released was a fiery gnome named Millhouse Monostorm. While the circumstances of his imprisonment are not known, it is likely he ended up here by accident after some mishap or another. Millhouse was thankful to be freed, though who knows how he handled being imprisoned next to a minion of the old gods for so long. Meanwhile, the assault on the Botanica continues apace. A place of study of life and the living, repurposed into a combination military headquarters and experimental laboratory by the Sun Fury. Soranus was one of the chief commanders of all Sun Fury forces, and was desperately rallying troops to deal with the oncoming Azerothian onslaught, as well as dealing with issues behind her own lines. Issues exacerbated by High Botanist Freywind's insistence on continuing to recklessly experiment with everything he found. His experiments were fueled by the sacrifices performed by Thorngren the Tender, a satyr on loan from Kil'jaeden. But as is quickly becoming a trend, the Sun Fury had lost real control of the Botanica, and one of their worst experiments, Lodge the Shifting Lasher, was making a mess of things. At the center of all this was an ancient of the arcane, Warp Splinter, who was driven mad by the chaos and sadly had to be put down. With these two problems snuffed out, all that remained was the satellite the Sun Fury maintained the tightest control over, Mechanar, where they generate and distribute the monocells that were being smuggled into the Magister's Terrace. The Mechanar was defended by the two Gate Watchers, Gyrokill and Ironhand, who lent their Moarg expertise to operations headed up by the Mechanolord Capacitus, original name unknown. But these were the engineers. The one in charge of managing this whole affair was the Nethermancer Sepethria, skilled summoner and direct apprentice to Pethelion the Calculator. Pethelion was never a particularly sane nor virtuous elf, and had climbed his way up the ranks of the Sun Fury by reckless experimentation, entirely in pursuit of fame and acclaim. Pethelion was not overly pleased at the loss of the Monoforges, and alluded to a great project which was being hurriedly finished even as he was felled. With this, the combined Aldor, Scryer, and Horde Alliance force invaded the Tempest Keep. Within were the true elites of the Sun Fury, the most skilled, the most dedicated, though for some reason quite a few were missing. Regardless, their first major obstacle was Alar, Kael'thas' pet phoenix, a specific form of fire elemental designed to renew itself upon death, though only if it was able to do so before being destroyed in its recovering form. Further in, they found the Void Reaver, which was to be a new Sun Fury superweapon, a Fel Reaver rebuilt and repurposed by the Blood Elves, powered by the arcane energies gathered from the Netherstorm, instead of burning souls. The keep itself was helmed by High Astromancer Solarian, a Blood Elf who sought to control and harness the Void, something the late Darkhan Drathir had tampered with as well. At this, nothing was left to bar their path but the Prime Advisors and, at their deaths, Kael'thas himself. The prince was, true to his lineage and position, a tremendously powerful mage, and easily the second most terrible foe the adventurers had faced thus far. Emboldened by his advisors, their enchanted weapons, and finally the magical energy stored in the keep itself, Kael'thas was, at length, slain. With his fall, it was believed the final threat to Outland had been silenced, and in this, they were partially correct. But in short order, it was discovered why so many forces and energy had been redirected to the Magister's Terrace and Quel'Danas. Kael'thas' demon loyalists, calling themselves the Shadow Sword, were going to reignite the Sunwell in order to use its energies to summon Kil'jaeden personally into Azeroth. In direct response to this, the Aldor and Scryers formally unified their military structure, reorganizing into the Shattered Sun. They found their forces bolstered by the Blood Elves under the command of the penitent Lady Liadrin, and the overwhelming majority of remaining Blood Elves who had abandoned Kael'thas, disgusted by the prince and his actions. The unified Shattered Sun offensive began to reclaim the Isle of Quel'Danas. The Shadow Sword, for their part, were bolstered by Rogue Naga of the Darkspine and scores of demons. The fighting was fierce and bloody. Once a foothold was established by the offensive, the Horde Alliance force assaulted the Magister's Terrace, where Kael'thas was overseeing the campaign. Inside, they found Wretched, Sunblades, Coilscar, Ethereum, and Demon holdovers. While not the strongest, these were the most fanatical and loyal of the disparate Kil'jaeden forces across Outland, unified to ensure his summoning. Sellen Fireheart was one of Kael'thas' personal guards, and followed his master in demonic servitude, growing drunk to the point of insanity on Fel power, making him one of the very first of the Fel Elves. Just beyond him is an arcane elemental, Vixalis, summoned to serve as a deterrent for intruders. Appropriately, for how well things were going for the Shadow Swords, the elves who summoned it were killed in the process. Immediately past this, the adventurers encountered Kael'thas, the blue dragon. Kael'thas had been involved in the affairs of the Sunwell for some time, as one might expect from one of the blue dragonflight, who were masters of the arcane. Kael'thas was working alongside Madragosa, another blue dragon, to assist the Shattered Sun offensive, and flew ahead to the Sunwell Plateau itself. This left the adventurers with Priestess Delrissa, the Shavara who resurrected Kael'thas, by jamming a Fel crystal into his chest. Resurrected but gorged in Fel energies, Kael'thas was a shadow of his former self, in power and skill, but also in mind. Far weaker from his previous setback, Kael'thas was slain and, in his final moments, raved that his killers would drown in their own blood as Azeroth burned. With Kael'thas dead, again, and Kil'jaeden's forces disorganized, all that remained were the hard loyalists within the Sun Plateau itself, who were frantically attempting to summon their lord as quickly as they could before their last bastion was overrun. The forces here were no joke. These were the strongest of the Fel elves and demons forming Kil'jaeden's personal retinue. And the offensive's first opposition was Kael'thas. A bit confused by this, the Azerothian forces soon realized he was being actively possessed by the Nothrazim Sathravar the Corruptor. Upon Sathravar's removal, Kael'thas regained his senses and swiftly took off to assist in endeavors elsewhere. While all Annihilan are warfare-oriented, most lend themselves towards being warrior mages. Not Brutalis, a pure berserker ball of demonic rage. Brutalis was legendary for his combat prowess. After butchering Madragosa, Brutalis was barely defeated by the Azerothians and, sadly, his blood spilled out onto the battlefield and enveloped the dead Madragosa. As anyone familiar with Manaroth or Magtheridon will tell you, Annihilan blood is an incredibly concentrated corruptive force, and her corpse rose again as Felmest, a near-mindless slave of Kil'jaeden. Beyond were the Eredar twins, Sacrilash and Alethes, chief defilers of Kil'jaeden who wielded flame and shadow in unison. Despite their considerable skill, the twins were removed, leaving only one thing between Adventurer and Sundwell. One last barrier erected specifically to impede their progress. M'Uru. M'Uru was long since gone, drained of his light and lashing out blindly at anything within reach. The Azerothians had no choice but to destroy the Naru and, in the process, witnessed the exact moment of Inaru's death as it rebirthed into a void god, Entropius. With Entropius destroyed, Velen and Liadrin both lamented the loss of M'Uru, Liadrin in particular regretting what the actions of her Blood Knights had done to the being. But this was no time for regrets. Just beyond lay the Sunwell. But the Azerothians were a little too late, as the summoning had just completed and Kil'jaeden partially emerged into Azeroth. Kil'jaeden might only be fractionally summoned, but he was still a reigning demon lord of the Burning Legion, and was easily the fiercest fight the adventurers had ever faced. It took the Horde Alliance force, the Shattered Sun, Kael'thas, and the Sunwell's own avatar to be able to prevent Kil'jaeden from emerging completely, turning the Sunwell's power against him, and banishing him to whence he came. While more of a delay than a decisive victory, as all conflicts with the Legion inevitably were, this was still a great moment for the people of Azeroth. Even more so as the prophet Velen had an idea. Having recovered the heart of Ma'uru, the dead Naru's pure light energies merged fully with the Sunwell to reignite it, restoring the Blood Elves' connection and preventing any further starvation or madness for their people forevermore. Further, with the Naru's light energies mixing with the arcane, all Blood Elves were now permanently connected to the light in a way few species were. This blessing permanently saved their entire race, and it turns out was indeed the goal all along behind Ma'uru's deliberate sacrifices, staying behind in the Tempest Keep to be captured, allowing the Blood Knights to drain him, and his death by the Sunwell. Outland renewed, Kil'jaeden defeated, Blood Elves saved, Illidan and his Illidari dead or captured. All was well with the world.